Here's another book that I'm sure is going to just get tons and tons of hits. It's called Uncertain Victory, Social Democracy and Progressivism in European and American Thought, 1870 to 1920, by James T. Kloppenberg. Another one of those books that pops up on graduate lists, graduate course syllabi of intellectual and American and European history. You just see it all the time, so I read it. There are many books that provide a systematic history of a certain subject, like Louis Menon's Metaphysical Club. I know some of you have probably read that, for example, which looks at the birth of pragmatism in the United States around the time of the Civil War. But it's much rarer to find a book that starts with a philosophical foundation and then goes on beyond it and reaches into other fields. And that's precisely what James Kloppenberg does here, focusing on much the same subject that Menon discusses in his book, that is American Pragmatism. The project is really impressive in its scope, starting with the birth of American pragmatism and European historicism. He argues that many of the great liberal and progressive social reformers of this time period, unimpressed with the various dualisms that had dominated philosophy since the time of Descartes, used pragmatism and the ideals of philosophical liberalism to undergird their social programs and ideas. During the first third of the book, Kloppenberg details why previous philosophical ideas proved unable to deal with complex social and philosophical problems, and why this dissatisfaction necessitated the birth of pragmatism. He focuses here on 6 thinkers and their critiques of previous ideas. These thinkers are William James, Alfred Fouillée, Wilhelm Dilthey, T.H. Green, Henry Sedgwick, and John Dewey. The general criticism they level against previous philosophical thought was its interaction between subject and object, or in the language of psychology, between stimulus and response, which assumed they could be separated and thought of as different entities. Dewey especially takes this idea to task, calling for experience to be understood as a unified whole, instead of a series of subjects understanding different objects. He said that we need to think of experience as this is actually a sort of well-known phrase by him, a reflex circuit instead of an arc. So sort of a feedback loop that's not one way, but something more resembling sort of like a electric feedback loop, circuitry, a breadboard. James, whose early career was just as much involved in psychology as it was in philosophy, elaborated on these points, creating what is, in effect, a uniquely American epistemology, focusing on the wholeness of lived experience instead of abstract theoretical interactions between the mind and reality. The Europeans of the group, especially Alfred Fouillée and Wilhelm Dilthey, tried to correct for the ahistorical trends that were prevalent in a lot of philosophy at the time. Descartes and Kant had conceived of knowledge as happening in the utterly disconnected brain, unconditioned by culture or society. To even study one person in a specific context is pointless, since according to Dilthey, quote, the connection of the individual with humanity is a reality. The starting point lies in my consciousness, so far as it contains a coherence of knowledge which is in agreement with other consciousnesses perceived by me, a coherence, therefore, which extends beyond my own consciousness. Here, Dilthey gives us what is more or less a pragmatist theory of truth, one that emphasizes coherence more than a correspondence theory of reality. Disenfranchised by both philosophical idealism and empiricism, these thinkers opted for history as the source of immanent critique and the basis for all foundational judgments. Kloppenberg then makes the move away from these radicals. He's always calling them radicals or renegades. These radicals critiques of epistemology toward their own critiques of ethics. Previous systems, and he discusses especially Benthamite utilitarianism, provided a final lasting system of ethical principles. As Fouly noted in The Psychology of the Idée Force, while the dualism of pleasure and pain, quote, may constitute the dominant quality of original sensations, it's hardly the sole content of human consciousness. By failing to differentiate between experiences, he argues that Bentham's calculus of happiness ultimately proves inadequate. There was also a growing acknowledgement between public, that is, the commonweal, and private interests, which Kloppenberg terms prudence, but might more appropriately be called self-interest. Henry Sedgwick, the moral philosopher, and Wilhelm Dilthey, the German philosopher, and James especially doubted that tragic collisions between self-interest and the requirements of justice could ever be prevented. All six thought that politics was ultimately reducible to philosophical questions over values, about which there can be no final answers. While the first half of the book focuses on the history of philosophical traditions and a critique thereof, the second half considers how contemporaries express similar ideals, though they sought to locate them in the action of social reform and progressivism. Again, Kloppenberg presents six representative thinkers: Edward Bernstein, Richard T. Ely, Beatrice Webb, her husband Sidney Webb, Jean Jaurès, and Walter Rauschenbusch. Kloppenberg claims that, quote, there is a distinctive continuity between the two groups' philosophical and political ideas. The similarity here seems to be mostly in their respective views of history. Only Bernstein spoke of a critique of socialist reason, but all of them thought that socialism should let go of its scientific pretense. The pretense to science is just a smug confidence, quote, in the inevitable triumph of the proletariat. Instead, they argued for a radically empiricist approach to historical understanding, approaching knowledge as a, quote, conscious process of truth testing and its recognition of the historical and qualitative dimensions of understanding. In the last few chapters, another set of six, yes, a third set of six people, are considered in the context of mostly European power politics. And these thinkers are Léon Bourgeois, Leonhard T. Hobhouse, Max Weber, Herbert Croly, Walter Lippmann, and John Dewey Redux. The second half of the book begins to flirt with something Susan Hack once referred to in a New Criterion article as vulgar Rortyism, referring to Richard Rorty. As I mentioned above, these thinkers criticized Marxist conceptions of history for their scientism, but Kloppenberg almost leads the reader to believe that pragmatism should be in the service of democratic politics. He also manages to turn pragmatism, a relatively well-defined, mostly American philosophical tradition, into something smacking of mushy relativism. Granted, the author never includes pragmatists like Charles Sanders Peirce, who emphasize the role of logic and science in any of the 17 people that he examines, but this strand of thought seems to get lost, sort of dubious trade in what seems to be a book about the historical development of pragmatism and Anglo-European historicism. While I found the intellectual connections and the intellectual history in the first part of the book really fascinating, Kloppenberg fails when trying to show that those same ideas influenced the second and third groups. He just flatly claims that the philosophers influenced the social reformers and progressives, but never connects the threads for the reader, which is a serious fault in a book of intellectual history, which is trying to create those threads. And none of this is helped by the fact that Kloppenberg insists on covering the contributions of so many people. In parts, it seems like a rush to list all the contributions and name the important books associated with each of them. For sheer ambition and breadth, I think it's an interesting book, and I can certainly understand why you see it on graduate syllabi all the time, especially interesting if you're excited by Kloppenberg's interdisciplinarity, which is impressive. But for being included on so many of those syllabi, there are a lot of weaknesses here that I was pretty surprised to find.